The village of Ndimu lay nestled between rolling green hills and a vast, winding river that sparkled under the golden rays of the sun. It was a place where the scent of fresh earth mingled with the sweet aroma of wildflowers, where the rustling leaves carried whispers of old legends, and where tradition was as unshakable as the great baobab trees that stood tall in the village square. Life in Ndimu moved at a steady, predictable rhythm, each day beginning with the crow of roosters and ending with the distant lull of drums that told stories of ancestors long past. The people of Ndimu prided themselves on their customs, passed down through generations like sacred heirlooms. Marriages, in particular, were not matters of love or personal choice, but of honor, duty, and the strengthening of family ties. It was believed that the elders, with their wisdom and foresight, knew best when it came to choosing suitable spouses for the young. A marriage was not just a union between two people, it was a binding thread in the intricate tapestry of the village's harmony. To reject such an arrangement was to invite disgrace upon one's family, a fate worse than hardship itself. Abeni, the daughter of Chief Alawu, had been raised with the finest teachings of the land. Her mother, a woman of grace and quiet strength, had taught her the ways of the home, how to weave the finest cloth, cook meals rich with spices, and speak with the dignity befitting a woman of her status. But Abeni was not only beautiful, with skin as smooth as river-polished stones and eyes that held the depth of the night sky, she was intelligent and ambitious. She dreamed of a future where she would be married to a man of wealth, one who would adorn her in gold and silken fabrics, a man whose laughter would fill grand halls and whose generosity would command respect. She had imagined love as something gentle, something that blossomed under the warmth of kind words and thoughtful gestures. In her heart, she had quietly hoped that her father, wise and just, would see her worth and betroth her to a suitor who matched her desires. She had even dared to believe that she might have a say in her own fate. But fate, as it often did, had other plans. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, Abeni was summoned before her father. His expression was solemn, his voice steady, yet there was a weight behind his words that made her heart pound. "You are to be married, Abeni," he announced, his gaze firm. Her breath caught, excitement flickering in her chest. But before she could ask who her betrothed was, he spoke the name that shattered every dream she had carefully built. Tunde, the farmer's son. Silence pressed against her ears, loud and suffocating. The name lingered in the air like a cruel joke. Tunde was not a merchant's son, not a warrior of great renown, not the heir to a prosperous household. He was a simple man, a hard-working farmer who toiled under the relentless sun, whose hands were calloused from years of tilling the earth. He was everything she had never imagined for herself. Her world tilted. How could this be? Abeni's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at her father, searching his face for any sign that this was a mistake, that he would reconsider. But Chief Alawu's gaze was unwavering, the lines of his face carved deep with the weight of his decision. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, father. I cannot marry him." Her mother gasped softly, and the air in the hut grew thick with tension. Abeni had never openly defied her father before. He was a man of great authority, not only within their family but in the entire village of Ndimu. To question his judgment was unthinkable. Chief Alawu's expression did not change. "You will marry Tunde," he said, his voice firm but calm, like a river that had carved its course and would not be diverted. "It has been decided." Abeni's pulse raced. "But he is just a farmer. I deserve—" "What you deserve is a husband who will honor you," her father cut in, his tone turning sharp. "Tunde is a good man. Hard-working. Respectful. He may not be wealthy, but wealth does not build a strong home. Character does." Abeni clenched her fists. "But I do not love him." Her mother stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "Love will come in time, my daughter. The heart can be taught." The words felt like shackles around her ankles. Abeni wanted to argue, to plead, but she knew it would be useless. Her fate had already been sealed. The next morning, the village elders gathered at their home, nodding in approval as the chief explained his decision. They spoke of duty, of obedience, of the honor Abeni would bring her family by fulfilling this union. The weight of tradition bore down on her like a stone pressing against her chest. She wanted to scream. To run. But where could she go? As the days passed, preparations for the wedding began. Women from the village arrived at her home, bringing with them fine fabrics, golden beads, and scented oils to prepare her for the ceremony. They sang as they worked, weaving intricate braids into her thick black hair, dusting her skin with fragrant powders, dressing her in a gown fit for a queen. They called her lucky. They called her blessed. Abeni felt neither. She sat motionless as they adorned her, her reflection in the bronze mirror a stranger's face. Inside, she was a storm, anger, sadness, resentment twisting together like raging winds. She thought of all the things she had once imagined for herself, a life filled with luxury, a husband who would cherish her with gifts and sweet words, a future beyond the dirt of a farm. Tunde had sent gifts, as tradition demanded, baskets of yams, fine cloth, a carved wooden stool. He had done everything right. But Abeni felt nothing when she looked at them. She felt nothing when she thought of him. The night before the wedding, Abeni sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames. She thought of running away, disappearing into the forests beyond Nimu, starting a new life where she could make her own choices. But she knew it was impossible. A woman who defied marriage brought disgrace upon her family. There would be no place for her in any village. And so, on the day of the wedding, she stood in the center of the village, her heart cold as the drums beat loudly, announcing the union. The entire village had gathered, women in brightly colored wrappers, men in embroidered tunics, children dancing at the edges of the crowd. It was a grand celebration, a spectacle of joy. But Abeni felt like a prisoner in the middle of it all. Tunde stood beside her, dressed in his finest attire, his posture proud yet humble. He was not unkind. In fact, he had always been gentle, speaking with a quiet dignity that many in the village admired. But as he reached for her hand, Abeni felt only resentment. The village elder recited the ancestral blessings, pouring libations to the spirits. Words of prosperity, fertility, and happiness filled the air. The villagers cheered. The drums grew louder. And just like that, Abeni was bound to a man she did not love. As the sun set and the last of the wedding feast was served, Abeni sat in her new home, a small hut on the edge of the village, far from the grand compound she had once known. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows against the walls. Tunde sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "I know you did not want this," he said quietly. Abeni did not respond. "I do not expect you to love me," he continued. "But I promise I will never bring you harm." His voice was sincere, but it did nothing to soothe the ache in her chest. Abeni turned away, staring at the doorway, where the night stretched endlessly beyond. Somewhere, far away, she imagined a different life. A different fate. But fate, she knew, could not be escaped. The first morning in her new home, Abeni awoke to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant chatter of women drawing water from the village well. The hut was dimly lit, the thin morning light filtering through the woven mat that covered the small window. The air smelled of burning wood and damp earth. She sat up slowly, her body aching from sleeping on the firm, straw-stuffed mat that served as their bed. It was a far cry from the soft, thick layers of woven blankets she had known in her father's house. Tunde was already gone, leaving behind the warmth of where he had slept. Abeni was grateful for that. She was not ready to face him, not ready to play the part of a loving wife when resentment still curled inside her like a trapped bird. She stepped outside, taking in the sight of her new surroundings. The hut was small, one room, with a low wooden table and a few clay pots stacked in the corner. A cooking fire sat at the side, its embers still glowing faintly from the night before. Surrounding the hut was a stretch of farmland, green with growing crops, yams, cassava, and maize, lined in neat rows that spoke of careful hands tending to them. In her father's house, she had never worried about work. Servants prepared her food, fetched her water, and ensured that she never lifted more than a woven fan to cool herself in the midday heat. But here, she was expected to be a wife, to tend to the home, to share in the labor that kept them alive. Her stomach tightened as she glanced toward the well in the distance, where women carried clay pots on their heads, balancing them with effortless grace. She had never had to fetch water before. The thought of struggling with the weight of it, of stumbling and spilling it before she even reached the hut, filled her with shame. Determined not to embarrass herself, she set off toward the well, ignoring the curious glances of the other women. Some whispered as she passed, their voices low but not low enough. "She does not belong here. She will not last. She was raised in silk, how will she live among farmers?" Abeni kept her head high, her pride refusing to let their words sink in. She would not break, not in front of them, not in front of Tunde. But as she reached the well and lifted the heavy clay pot, her arms trembled under the unfamiliar strain. Water sloshed over the rim, soaking her wrapper. The other women exchanged glances, some amused, some pitying, before turning away. By the time she made it back to the hut, her arms ached, and her feet were covered in dust. She wanted to collapse, to bury herself in sleep and forget the day had even started. But there was no time for rest. Tunde returned from the fields at midday, his face and arms covered in a sheen of sweat, his hands streaked with dirt. He paused when he saw her sitting on the stool, her face unreadable. "You didn't eat," he noted, his voice gentle. Abeni did not answer. Without another word, he took a wooden bowl and ladled some yam porridge into it before setting it in front of her. She stared at it, unwilling to touch the food he had worked so hard to provide. Tunde sighed but said nothing. He simply picked up his own bowl and ate in silence. Days turned into weeks, and the routine remained the same. Abeni struggled with each new task, pounding yams until her arms felt like they would fall off, stirring pots of stew over an open fire, washing clothes by the river with the other women who never stopped whispering. Every misstep, every moment of hesitation, was noticed. Tunde, however, never raised his voice. When she burned the food, he ate without complaint. When she forgot to sweep the hut, he picked up the broom himself. When she ignored him, he gave her space. He was patient. Kind. But Abeni refused to soften. The villagers watched them with knowing eyes. They saw the way Abeni avoided looking at Tunde, the way she walked stiffly beside him at village gatherings but never spoke unless spoken to. They whispered about her, shaking their heads. She still sees herself as a chief's daughter. Does she not see how lucky she is? Many women would be grateful for such a man. She will never love him. Perhaps they were right. Abeni could not imagine ever feeling anything but resentment for the man she had been forced to marry. He may have been good, but he was not the life she had wanted. And no matter how kind he was, he would never be the husband of her dreams. Each night, as Tunde lay on one side of the bed and she lay on the other, staring at the thatched roof above her, she wondered how long she could endure this life. How long before she became just another village wife, her dreams buried beneath the weight of duty. She refused to believe that this was all there was for her. Fate had taken her choices away once. But maybe, just maybe, it would still have something more in store for her. The midday sun blazed overhead as Abeni walked through the village square, balancing a small basket of dried cassava on her hip. The marketplace was bustling with activity, traders shouting prices, children chasing each other between stalls, and women haggling over fresh produce. The scent of roasted plantains and groundnut soup lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy aroma of the village. She moved with purpose, ignoring the stares of the villagers who still watched her with thinly veiled curiosity. Weeks had passed since her wedding, yet she knew the whispers had not stopped. A chief's daughter, now a farmer's wife. They wondered if she would ever truly belong. Just as she reached the yam seller's stall, a hush fell over the marketplace. Conversation slowed, then ceased entirely, as eyes turned toward the far end of the square. A stranger had arrived. Abeni followed their gazes and saw him. An old man, wrapped in a faded brown robe, walking with a staff carved from dark wood. His skin was the color of deep earth, wrinkled with the passage of many years. Though his back was slightly bent, there was strength in his step, a presence that made even the most skeptical villagers pause. A woven bag hung across his shoulder, the beads in his long gray beard clinking softly as he moved. A whisper rippled through the crowd. The seer. He has come again. It has been years since he last walked this land. Abeni frowned, glancing at the woman beside her. Who is he? The woman looked at her as though she had asked why the river flowed. They call him Baba Odi, she murmured. A traveler. A teller of fate. Abeni scoffed, though her fingers tightened around the basket. A teller of fate? The woman nodded. They say he speaks only when the spirits command him. That his words are never without meaning. Abeni had no patience for such nonsense. If the spirits had any say in fate, they had certainly failed her. Yet, as she turned away, something unexpected happened. Baba Odi's gaze settled on her. Abeni felt a strange jolt in her chest. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, studied her as though he could see through her skin, through her thoughts, through every secret she had buried inside. She swallowed, gripping her basket tighter. Then, without warning, he began to move toward her. The villagers whispered in awe as he stopped before her, close enough that she could see the intricate carvings on his staff, symbols she did not recognize. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice as rough as the wind over dry fields, he spoke. Fate changes like the river's course. Abeni blinked. The words sent a shiver down her spine. What? Baba Odi did not repeat himself. He simply tilted his head, as if listening to something beyond the realm of ordinary ears, then turned and walked away, his staff tapping against the ground. The villagers watched him go, murmuring among themselves, but Abeni stood frozen. Fate changes like the river's course. It was nonsense. And yet, the words clung to her like mist on a cool morning, refusing to fade. That night, long after Tunde had fallen asleep, Abeni lay awake, staring at the roof of their hut. She did not believe in prophecies. She did not believe in fate. But something deep within her whispered that her life was about to change. The evening air was thick with the scent of burning wood and freshly tilled earth. Abeni sat outside the hut, absently peeling cassava while the sky darkened to a deep shade of indigo. Crickets had begun their nightly song, filling the silence between her and Tunde, who was finishing his work nearby. It had been another long day, one filled with the same routine of cooking, cleaning, and enduring the quiet endurance of a life she still refused to claim as her own. But something lingered at the edge of her thoughts, something she had not been able to shake since that afternoon in the village square. Baba Odi's words haunted her. Fate changes like the river's course. She had dismissed them at first, but the more she thought about it, the more she wondered, had the old seer seen something she could not? Just then, the distant sound of voices drifted through the trees, breaking her thoughts. Abeni turned her head, frowning. It was coming from the chief's compound, just beyond the cluster of trees that separated their home from the heart of the village. She recognized one of the voices immediately. Tunde. Curiosity sparked in her, and before she could think better of it, she rose silently, moving closer. She kept to the shadows, pressing herself against the rough bark of a palm tree as she listened. It is time, Tunde, the village chief's deep voice said. You cannot remain in hiding forever. Abeni's brow furrowed. Hiding? Tunde's voice was quieter, but firm. I have made my peace with this life, Baba. There is nothing left for me to reclaim. The chief sighed. You say this, but your blood is royal. It does not forget. Abeni's breath caught in her throat. Royal? She pressed closer, her heart pounding as she strained to hear more. Tunde, you are the son of a king, the chief continued. You cannot bury that truth beneath the soil of a farm. The people of Ajoran still whisper your father's name, still mourn the day he was betrayed. I am no longer a prince, Tunde said flatly. That title died with my father. Abeni covered her mouth, shock rolling through her in waves. Tunde, a prince? It was impossible. He was just a simple farmer, a man she had resented for his poverty, for the humble life she had been forced into. How could it be true? The chief's voice softened. You were a child when it happened. You do not remember the full story. I remember enough, Tunde said bitterly. My father trusted the wrong men. He was betrayed by those closest to him, slaughtered in the middle of the night. My mother and I barely escaped with our lives. There was a pause. Do you think I do not dream of vengeance? Tunde went on, his voice edged with quiet fury. Do you think I do not long to see justice served? But what would I do? Gather a handful of farmers and march into the palace with my hoe raised like a sword? No. That life is gone. I have made my peace with it. The chief exhaled. Perhaps. But fate has a way of calling us back to who we are. Abeni stepped back, her mind spinning. Tunde was not a simple farmer. He was the son of a king, a prince in exile, a man whose past had been stolen from him. The realization unsettled her. For so long, she had resented him for his status. She had believed she had been condemned to a life of struggle, shackled to a man with no wealth, no power. But now she saw him differently. She did not return to the hut immediately. She sat outside, staring at the stars, her thoughts tangled. For the first time since she had married Tunde, she felt something shift inside her. She had always thought she was the only one who had lost something in this marriage. But perhaps, she was not the only one carrying the weight of an unwanted fate. And perhaps, just perhaps, Baba Odi's words were beginning to make sense. It was an ordinary afternoon when the messengers arrived, but nothing would remain ordinary after that day. Abeni was at the riverbank, washing clothes alongside the other village women. The sun bore down on them, beads of sweat rolling down her neck as she worked in silence, half listening to the others gossip about the latest happenings in Demu. She had learned to endure their whispers and sidelong glances, though she still felt like an outsider in many ways. Then, a distant commotion broke the stillness of the afternoon. The sound of hooves pounding against the dirt road, the urgent cries of children running ahead to alert the village of approaching visitors. Abeni straightened, her hands still in the cool river water, and exchanged glances with the other women. Visitors were rare, especially those who arrived on horseback. She quickly gathered her washing and made her way back toward the village, her heart pounding with an inexplicable sense of unease. By the time she reached the main square, a crowd had gathered. At the center of it stood three men, dressed in fine but dusty robes, their faces streaked with sweat from long travel. Their horses stood nearby, their flanks heaving from exhaustion. The tallest of the men, a broad-shouldered warrior with a deep scar across his cheek, stepped forward. His gaze swept across the gathered villagers before resting on a single person. Tunde. Abeni felt her breath catch as the stranger spoke, his voice ringing with the weight of authority. We have come for the rightful heir. A murmur ran through the crowd. Confused whispers, incredulous gasps. Tunde stood still, his face unreadable. I don't know what you mean, he said, though Abeni could hear the tension beneath his calm words. The warrior took another step forward. The tyrant has fallen, he declared. The kingdom of Ajoran is free. But it has no ruler. The people cry out for justice, for a leader of true blood. He pointed directly at Tunde. You are the son of King Adateo. The last living heir. You must return. Abeni's breath came in short, sharp bursts. It was true, then. What she had overheard in secret was no simple tale of the past, it was his reality. And now, the past had come to claim him. The village chief stepped forward, his expression grave. These are serious words, warrior, he said. You must know that we do not take kindly to deception. There is no deception, the warrior said firmly. We have searched for years, following every whispered rumor, every trail that led us closer to the lost prince. And now, we have found him. The crowd erupted in disbelief, shock rippling through the villagers. Abeni barely heard them. She turned to Tunde, searching his face for any sign of what he was feeling. But he was stone, silent, unmoving. Then, at last, he spoke. "I am no prince," he said, his voice low. "I am a farmer. My life is here." The second messenger stepped forward, an older man with sorrow in his eyes. "You may have lived as a farmer," he said, "but your blood has not changed. You are King Adeteo's son, and that cannot be erased. You must reclaim what was stolen from you." Abeni's hands curled into fists. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about Tunde, was unraveling before her eyes. The man she had married out of obligation, the man she had resented for his simplicity, was no simple man at all. He was royalty. And now, he was being called to take his place as king. The weight of it settled on her chest like a heavy stone. If he went, what would become of her? Would she remain here, forgotten? Or would she be forced into a life she had never imagined, one she had never prepared for? For the first time since her marriage, she truly saw the man before her. Tunde was no longer just a humble farmer. He was something much, much more. The journey to Ajoran was unlike anything Abeni had ever experienced. The village of Ndinu had erupted into celebration and awe as the truth of Tunde's lineage spread. The man they had known as a simple farmer, quiet, hard-working, and patient, was in fact a king. Even those who once pitted Abeni for being married to him now looked upon her with reverence, whispering that she was destined for a greater fate than they had ever imagined. Tunde did not revel in the sudden change. He remained the same, calm, steady, and reluctant. Yet, there was a shift in him, something Abeni had never seen before. A quiet strength, an unshakable presence. The way he held himself as they rode toward Ajoran, the way his eyes scanned the horizon, not with uncertainty, but with the awareness of a man who carried the weight of an entire kingdom. Abeni rode beside him, wrapped in fine robes the messengers had brought for them, her mind still trying to catch up with the events of the past few days. She had spent so long resenting her marriage, mourning the life she had lost, that she had never considered what she had gained. She glanced at Tunde, watching the way the sun cast sharp shadows against his strong features. He had always been kind, always patient, and now, she saw it for what it was, not weakness, but wisdom. For the first time, she wondered if she had misjudged him. As they neared the capital city, the roads became lined with people, men, women, and children who had once been ruled by a tyrant, now weeping with joy, throwing petals in their path. "The king has returned," they cried. Abeni watched as Tunde straightened in his saddle, his expression unreadable. For so long, he had lived as a farmer, content in his exile. Now, he was being called to be something greater. And for the first time, she believed he was meant for it. In the grand halls of the palace, Abeni watched as Tunde moved through the court, speaking with advisors, settling disputes, and listening to the concerns of his people. There was no arrogance in his manner, no hunger for power, only a quiet resolve to rule justly. She had spent years believing that wealth made a man valuable, that riches determined his worth. But here, in the golden light of the throne room, she saw the truth. Tunde had always been a king, not because of his birthright, but because of the strength in his heart. At first, she had felt like a stranger in the palace, a woman who had stumbled into a world that was never meant for her. But as days turned into weeks, something inside her began to shift. She no longer saw Tunde as the poor farmer she had resented. She saw the man who had never stopped being kind, never wavered in his patience, even when she had given him nothing but coldness in return. And slowly, without realizing when it had begun, love took root in her heart. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the kingdom, she turned to him. "You never told me," she said softly. "Told you what?" "That you were a king all along." Tunde smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. Would it have changed anything? Abeni thought about it. Once, she would have said yes. But now, she shook her head. "No," she admitted. "Because it wasn't your crown that made you different. It was you." His gaze lingered on her, searching, waiting. And for the first time, she did not look away. When the news of their reign reached Ndinu, the village was filled with astonishment. The same people who had pitied her, who had whispered about her misfortune, now spoke of destiny and fate. Her family, once so firm in their belief that she had been married beneath her station, now sent messages of pride, and, perhaps, regret. But none of it mattered anymore. Abeni no longer longed for the life she had left behind. She had found something greater, something she had never expected. She had found love. It was on a quiet evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, that Baba Odi returned. Abeni was walking through the palace gardens, breathing in the scent of blooming jasmine, when she saw him standing near the entrance, his old staff in hand, his tattered robes untouched by time. She stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. He looked exactly as he had the day he spoke to her in Ndinu, ancient yet timeless, his knowing eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "You again," she murmured, stepping closer. The seer chuckled. "Did you think our paths would never cross again, little one?" Abeni studied him, and for the first time, she did not doubt his words, nor did she dismiss them as riddles. "You knew," she said slowly. "You knew this would happen." Baba Odi tapped his staff on the ground. "Fate changes like the river's course, I told you. But did you believe me then?" She lowered her gaze, ashamed of how blind she had been. "I thought I was being punished," she admitted. "I thought I had lost everything." But now, she lifted her head, her voice softer, filled with the realization that had settled deep within her heart. "I see that I was being led to something greater." The old man nodded approvingly. "Sometimes, what we resist most is what we need the most. Fate is not always cruel, child, it only appears so when we do not yet understand its design." Abeni glanced toward the palace, where Tunde was standing in the distance, speaking with his advisors. The man she had once resented, the man she had been forced to marry, had become the love of her life. She turned back to Baba Odi, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. The seer smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Do not thank me, my dear. Thank fate." And just like that, with the same quiet mystery that had always surrounded him, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Abeni stood there for a long moment, staring after him. She had spent so much time believing she was trapped, that she had been robbed of her dreams. But now, standing in the palace gardens as queen, as a woman who had found love and purpose, she understood. She had never been trapped. She had been guided. In the years that followed, Abeni fully embraced her role as queen. No longer the reluctant bride who had once resented her fate, she now stood proudly beside Tunde, ruling with wisdom, kindness, and strength. The kingdom of Ajoran flourished under their reign. Where once there had been suffering under a cruel ruler, now there was peace. Tunde, the farmer turned king, led not with greed or ambition, but with the steady patience he had always carried within him. He listened to his people, worked alongside them, and never forgot the lessons he had learned in the fields of Ndinu. And Abeni, once a woman who longed for wealth and comfort, now found joy in something far greater. She had wealth beyond measure, but it was not gold that filled her heart, it was love. Love for the man she had once overlooked, love for the people who now looked to her as their queen, and love for the life she had once thought was a mistake. One evening, as she and Tunde stood on the palace balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she thought back to the girl she had been, the girl who had cried at the thought of marrying a poor farmer, who had believed her life was ruined before it had even begun. She smiled to herself. "How strange life is," she mused aloud. Tunde glanced at her, a knowing glint in his eyes. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, reaching for his hand. "If someone had told me years ago that I would be here, standing beside you, I would have laughed and called them a fool." "And now?" he asked, lacing his fingers through hers. She met his gaze, her heart full. "Now, I know that fate is wiser than we are." Tunde chuckled. "Ah, so you finally understand what the seer meant?" Abeni laughed softly. "Yes. I was so busy fighting my fate that I didn't see the gift it was giving me." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Then, with quiet certainty, Abeni spoke again. "Sometimes, the path we fear the most is the one that leads us exactly where we are meant to be. And with that, the winds of destiny carried their story forward, a tale passed down through generations, of love found in the most unexpected places, of patience and wisdom, and of fate's ever-unfolding plan.